Be finishing up chapter number 11 with verses 31 and 32. And what do you think of when you think about promises? What do you think about when you hear the word faithfulness? There's a lot of things that come to mind. I'm thankful for promises today, and hopefully we're people and individuals that keep our promises or try our best to hold to what we say that we're going to do and what we promise to do. Hopefully we're like that, and also hopefully and prayerfully we're faithful to follow through and to be like that. And I'm thankful tonight that we know that we serve a God, that we serve the God of the universe, the God who created all things, the God that loved us so much that He gave His Son to die for our sins, that He is faithful and that the promises that He's given to us. I mean, we've looked at a lot of these already. One that comes to mind that we've already discussed is the promise that is in the sky of the rainbow. The rainbow to say that I will no longer or will never destroy the earth by flood waters again. And that's a wonderful promise, because when we see the rain come and we see it stop and we see those beautiful rainbow that's put there in the sky, it is a constant reminder for us of the promises of God. It's such a beautiful way for Him to do that. But we're going to look tonight about God's unconditional promises, and this is going to lead us into the aspect and the storyline of Abraham. And we're going to first reference him as Abram, and we know that he later on is called Abraham. But here in verse 31 and verse 32, it starts out about God's faithful selection, and it starts out talking about Abram's family history. And we see in verse number 31, it says, And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, Abram, who I mentioned to you that we're going to be referencing his name as here in this passage of Scripture, is later renamed Abraham, and he began a move at the prompting of his father Terah from one side to the other, what we now call the Fertile Crescent. And this was a movement here. And as we look at this, it's interesting because you see this lineage here with these individuals. We see how that Terah took Abram, his son, so we know that Terah is the father of Abram, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son. So these are characters that we're familiar with. We're familiar with Abraham. We're familiar with Lot. Now, a couple of things here that are interesting is as we look at some questions that are actually not answered here. First of all is a question of Abram's brother Haran. What happened to him? How did he die? What went on with this? And also, was Abram or Terah the primary caregivers for Lot? I feel like that Abram had a responsibility in some way, but we're not really told. It's not really specific and clear. And also another question here is, why did they decide to move from Ur of Chaldees to Canaan? Just a couple of things that aren't quite 100% clear here in this. There's some hypotheticals about this. Many believe that Ur was a very high-populated civilization, but also it had a lot of idol worship. It had a lot of unethical things that were taking place there. So those are some things, some possibilities there. But this is just a little bit of Abram's family history. And one thing you have to remember about Abram is that Abram did not come from a godly heritage. He actually come from a very idol worship background with where that he came from. Also here we see that God selects Abram. Let's move on here to chapter number 12, starting in verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." Now, Genesis introduces God's speech to Abram with the past perfect. Has said. Now, what does this possibly indicate? This indicates that God had previously communicated these words to Abram. And this also communicates a slow development in Abram's initial belief, making the following words all the more surprising. Remember, this future perfect, or this past perfect, I guess I should say, had said. And when you look at this, it's interesting when you look at names and what names mean. Because when you look at Terah, that means delay. And also Haran is barren. So Abram, partially following, not completely 100% following, would have meant a delay and barrenness. So that's interesting when you look at names and the relation there of how things took place. But also in Acts 7, verses 1 through 4, this is where Abram hears God first from God, and this is Mesopotamia in Ur. And this comes from Acts 7, verses 1 through 4. "Then said the high priest, Are these things so? And he said, Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken, the God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Charan, and said unto him, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Charan, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land, wherein ye now dwell." Now many believe that it's possible that Abram, with his wife Sarai, that they may have stayed a little too long. Because where they were, like I said, there was a lot of idol worship, a lot of false worship that was there. And with this being in reference to past perfect, it's very likely that God had already told him to move. And this is where he reintroduces this again by saying, has said. Now, despite Abram's reluctance to fully obey God, God still selected Abram to be the one through whom God would continue His plan and reveal Himself to the world. Now, God's choice on Abram was not based upon Abram's special ability to obey God. No, that wasn't the case. In fact, it seems to have been to have been reluctant to obey. And God's choice of Abram was not based on a legacy of generational faith in the true God. At best, his family members were recent converts from idolatry. Okay? And God's choice was based on His gracious and loving character. Now, in these verses that we just looked at here with Abram entering Canaan here, we're going to get to this here in just a moment. But we see here in verses 2 through 3 that God made several promises to Abram. The first one that He made was to make Abram into a great nation. Now, given the barren condition of Abram and Abram's age, at the age of 75 years of age, this is truly a remarkable promise. This is truly just something that is out of the ordinary for Him to give this promise. And we know what happens later on with Abraham and Sarah, where Sarah laughed and how that they could just not believe that they were going to be able to have a child. But here we look at this, that He promises to make Abram into a great nation. And secondly, was the promise to bless Abraham, to bless Abram. See, the word bless appears 5 times in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And in contrast, the word appears 5 times in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. See, God's blessing of Abram and his family is a major component of God's unique dealings with this family. And He blessed Abram. But also, thirdly, is that there was a promise to make Abram's name great. Now, this didn't mean that Abram would be famous, although that did actually happen, because anywhere you go, you hear Father Abraham and recorded in history as father of the Jewish nation. But here we see it was meant that his name would be highly regarded. That was what this meant, for his name to be great. And then fourthly, there was a blessing to those who would bless Abram, and a curse to the one who curses or dishonors Abram. Now here's a question, and this is just looking at this verse number 3. God used the plural when talking about blessing, and the singular when talking about cursing. What might this communicate about God in using the plural and the singular? Anybody with a thought? I thought on this for a while. Anybody with a thought? Heard that come across, thought, why is there a plural and a singular used here? I think, and I wrote this down, I think the word of blessing those who bless compared with cursing him who curses is a subtle communication of God's will to extend grace rather than punishment. He wants to bless more than He wants to curse. I mean, that would be quite obvious, right? But I don't know if you've ever read that verse before and thought, why is there a plural and a singular here in context to these? And that's personally what I think that is talking about there. But also, number 5, another promise here is He was a promise to communicate the universal implication of God's choice of Abram. Now, through this one man and his lineage, all the families of the earth would be blessed. God promised to deliver humanity from Satan through a descendant of Eve, and that descendant, Jesus, eventually came from this specific family. So these are promises that God made to Abram. And He promised him and said, this is what I am promising to you, and this is what it'll look like. So let's look here at number 2, and this is God demonstrates His faithfulness. And this is verse number 4 through 9, and we'll look at these together. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all of their substances that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. And they went forth to go unto the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanites was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land, and there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east side of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on an east, and there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Now, it's interesting to note that Canaan was about 400 miles to the southwest of Haran. So this was a journey. And many believe, before we even get to this passage and this part of this passage talking about what happened there in Egypt, but Abram and his family were nomads. They were just travelers. They were traveling along. They didn't have really much at all. But Abram followed what God had told him to do, and he left here. So here we see God's faithful and generousness about how He was faithful to Abram. Is that God immediately demonstrated His faithfulness to Abram by bringing him into the land He had promised to him, while Abram was still in Ur. And this is verse number 1. And despite the passage of many years and Abram's initial failure to obey, God was faithful to His word. See, God was not only taking Abram to a land, but He was also giving Abram the land. That's very important. Very important. Now, LOB is an acronym that is helpful in remembering the key aspects of God's initial promise to Abram in Genesis 12. Is that L is for land, O is for offspring, and B is for blessing. So there was a blessing of land, offspring, and then he received God's ultimate blessing upon Abram and his family. And then we come down here to verse number 7. This is interesting. And it says, "And the Lord appeared unto Abram." And this is the first time in the book of Genesis that we see a reference to where God appeared unto Abram. Now, it's likely that He appeared to other individuals, and we don't have that here in Scripture written like this. But it is likely that He appeared to Abram in some way. Many believe to be a theophany, a pre-incarnate Jesus, possibly, of a form that He appeared to Abram in. We're not 100% sure on that. But this is the first reference here of an actual appearance. And then in verse number 8, look what it says here. "And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east, and there be building an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord." So after Abram arrived in the land, he reciprocated God's faithfulness with faithfulness of his own. You know what it tells me sometimes is that oftentimes we're kind of stubborn and we don't like to listen the first time. I know of many people that have shared testimonies of God really working on their hearts to serve in some capacity and not being fully 100% committed to what God has led them to do. And then eventually they came around and they listened and were obedient to the call. But here we see that in a reciprocated manner, he responds with faithfulness of his own to God. And then we see God steadfast in His faithfulness. Look what it says here in verse number 10. "And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land." So like I mentioned to you, they're nomads and there's a famine that's there. So it's not really the best of situations. They're struggling. They're needing something here. "And it came to pass that when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon." Now, why would Abram have this thought process running through his mind? Well, he knew that the Egyptians and the Canaanites were descendants of Ham, and also they were polytheistic in nature, and also they had a very cruel way of treating individuals. So Abram knew. Abram, let's just be honest here. He knew his wife was beautiful. He knew she was pretty. And he knew that if they went here to Egypt, it would be very likely that if they came there, they'd just kill him and take her. That was his thought process. This is what he is thinking here. And he says this, he said, thou art a fair woman to look upon. And in verse number 12, therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Then in verse 13, say, I pray thee, that thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. Now, all right, he's did exactly what the Lord has told him to do. He's going and he's doing what he's supposed to do, and here he comes, and the first thing he wants to do is lie. You know, I've always said this, that nothing is ever good that comes birthed out of a lie. I mean, here we see that he is going to lie and say you're my sister, so they won't take my life. I mean, he's thinking of self here. And here we see in verse number 14, and it came to pass that when Abram was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman that she was very fair. So at least he knew. He knew his wife was beautiful and that she was fair to look upon. And here they come into Egypt, and the Egyptians say, man, this woman is beautiful. She's beautiful to behold here. And the prince also, the princess also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. So the princess commended her and said, wow, this woman's really beautiful. This woman's pretty. And I bet she was just a talk. And here she then is brought into Pharaoh's house. And he entreated Abram well for her sake. I've looked up that word well there, and obviously there's things to follow here, but this means that he loaded him up. You know what that terminology is? He gave him the goods. He gave him some good stuff. And he probably was very appreciative, very thankful for these things because of being a nomad, being in famine here. And it says, and Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen and he-asses and men servants and maidservants and she-asses and camels. He was loaded up, and you think about this, and after this, Abram was quite wealthy with what he had gotten here in Egypt. Now, God's providential protection of Abram, despite Abram's own poor decisions, highlights, I believe, God's consistently faithful character. See, the promises God gave to Abram, I keep saying Abraham, I refer to him here as Abram, were a tremendous blessing, but the promises were valuable only because God made the promises. So Abram, like I said, devises a plan to stay safe while in Egypt. And look what it says here in verse number 17. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Now, they didn't know what was going on. They had been lied to. And can you imagine that here come the plagues, and they're thinking, like, what have we done? Honestly, thinking, what is going on here? These plagues are coming our way. What have we done? They're probably trying to find every polytheistic answer of all their many gods, trying to pray and say, hey, what have we done? Trying to go to their individuals that had the communication between their false gods, trying to find answers. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife? Now here's a question I've thought of here. The Pharaoh asking Abram, how did they eventually come to the conclusion that it was that she was Abram's wife? You think one of the polytheistic ones felt one way and maybe they guessed, or maybe some way the Lord revealed it in a way? I've always thought that. Like, how did they find out that Sarai was actually his wife? Good question. May have. Very possible. Yeah. She may have thought, boy, I hate to see y'all go through this. I got to let this out. And then in verse number 19, why saidst thou, she is my sister? So I might have taken her to me to wife. Now therefore, behold, thy wife, take her, and go thy way. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had. Now God in His providence and God in His sovereignty, I've always read this passage and thought to myself, it would have been very easy for Pharaoh to have just killed him. I mean, he's making a joke. But also at the same time, I've always thought as well that Pharaoh is innocent here. But if you look back at this passage, there's something to really key in on. This is back in verse number 15. The prince also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Do you think possibly that she was taken against her will? I've come to that conclusion. I've always thought that the Pharaoh was innocent here, that he didn't know what was going on. I mean, he was really lied to. He was deceived. But is there a part here of maybe taking her against her own will? I guess we'll never know. One day we might know the answer to that. But I read through that, and I have thought about that some and pondered on that. But it says here in verse number 20, and Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife, and all that he had. And one thing for sure, Abraham left with a lot more than he come in with. I mean, he had a lot. He had a lot to take with him. And so even in the midst of this, God was working. You know, we've seen throughout history, we've seen throughout other biblical accounts, how that God used a bad situation and He can even still use it for His glory. Even in this lie, and we'll find later on it happens again with Isaac there, but as we see this, it's interesting to see how God works, and He's working behind the scenes. Even through times where we think that we've truly messed up. And I'll never forget one time Charles Spurgeon was preaching a sermon, and he was sick and he didn't feel good. And he said he got up to preach and he felt like that he had really butchered it, and that it was probably one of the worst sermons he'd ever preached. And he said that when the invitation was given, there was, I don't know how many souls that were saved that night because of him just being faithful. And even though he felt like he butchered it. And I think that even times that we feel like that we mess up and we fail, God's still working. In some way, shape, or form, He's still working. Even through this mess, this deception for Pharaoh, God was still working. And here he goes, and Abram leaves with more than he actually came in with. And then we see here in Genesis 13, 1 through 12, this concludes the Genesis 12 account. And these important verses communicate that Abram was greatly blessed in Egypt, just like I was talking to you about. It says, and Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. Now don't you know, just for a moment, just being practical here this evening, that as they left, Sarai looked at Abram and said, don't do that to me again. I don't know. I'm just being facetious here about that. And Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and gold. Now the same Hebrew word translated severe in reference to the famine in Genesis 12:10 is used also, the same word is used in chapter 13, verse number 2, to describe Abraham, and this means very rich. Man, isn't it interesting? From going from literally poor and nomad to being very rich. And this meant that Abram became severely rich in Egypt. His livestock gains can be attributed to Pharaoh's gifts. However, it is likely also that Abram earned the gold and silver mentioned through business dealings in the land. It's quite possible that he would have had some of those fortunes as well from dealings that he had as he was journeying. But interesting here how all this takes place. Obviously, it starts with a half-hearted obedience. And we see the past perfect, the tense there of God giving him the command again to leave. And here he goes. He's faithful. He goes out of the land, goes to Egypt, gets into some trouble. He's scared. He's terrified of what will happen. So he lies about his wife. And fortunately, under the protection, I believe, of a sovereign God working behind the scenes, Pharaoh doesn't choose to just take him out because of the deception, but he chooses to let him go. And as we see, Abram returns and follows as God's chosen individual to be the leader and to be the descendant, obviously, of Jesus. So, interesting as we see that, or in the lineage, Jesus being the descendant. All right, question, anything kind of caught your attention? Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Didn't that happen? In my mind, that I don't think it was Abram and Sarah, but they went somewhere else, and he said, "Tell them you're my sister." And whoever was a Pharaoh or something looked out his window and saw them holding hands or whatever, and knew right away that they weren't brother and sister. Heard him speaking, and I thought, huh? He heard him. Whoever walked by the window heard him speaking. Who was that? I can't remember. I thought it was this. Yeah. You know, it wasn't this one.
Mm-hmm. I know it happened to Isaac. I can't remember the passage.
Okay, maybe it was Isaac and his wife, where they went somewhere, and he said, so I guess like father, like son.
Yeah.
Obviously, though, Pharaoh knew that it was wrong to have somebody else's wife.
He didn't know his wife.
Yeah, but he didn't know, though.
He did know it after they told him.
Yeah.
Well, we don't know who told him.
I know.
Yes, but that's, yeah.
Once he knew, he said, I don't want any more plagues. Get out of here.
The only logical thing, like Max mentioned earlier, it's possible that Sarai could have told him, but we're not clear. We don't know. Some way he found out. And he brought it right to Abram's attention. And I mean, I think Abram was probably, he might have been more fearful in that moment than he was before because he knew that he had been caught. It would be very puzzling to know these plagues are happening and you don't know why until the beans are spilled. Somebody comes clean, and it's quite possible it could have been her, it could have been somebody else had heard, or someone in the camp. I don't know who it is that could have said that. Yeah. It's possible. Yeah. 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 Very possible. I just know the track record of Pharaohs, though. When you look in the Bible, I mean, you think about with Moses. I mean, even though they hardened his heart, I mean, he let them people go, and he realized, what have I done? And he went after them. He pursued after them, regardless. he said, okay, y'all leave because of all that's happened here. And that's sort of what I was thinking about with this Pharaoh, is that he could have just been so mad that he didn't care. He was just thinking, I'm just going to, how dare you come before me and do this to me in this manner, being deceitful, trying to pull literally the wool over my eyes, which he did for a short period of time, but then obviously the cat was out of the bag about the truth. So it's interesting when you look at this and you look at the context of the passage and see how all this comes to play and to fruition. Do you think, here's a question, do you think in Abram doing this, lying about that, do you think he was 100% committed, or you think he was almost to 100% committed in the process of lying? Yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking that, once again, just a question here, just to consider. Yeah.
People that we probably wouldn't considered our friends.
Yeah. Guess with his life on the line, he thought he had to come up with something quick. Because he knew that the descendants of Ham were polytheistic and they were cruel. And he knew that what was ahead of him, most likely, what would to come. And so he had to come up with a plan of his own. And so that's what leads me to think, was he distracted because of that thought process of thinking, I've got to do something, if not, I'm in trouble?
But he obviously didn't care what happened to her.
Yeah. And that happens when you're very selfish, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, but still,
Yeah. And that goes back to this unconditional promise. God promised these things to him even when he wasn't 100% right. God still brought him through this. In this situation, I believe he was spared, because it would have been very easy for Pharaoh to have done something. Yes, he knew what the plagues were, but it would have been very easy for him to have treated him in a harsh manner. But instead, he didn't even take the stuff back. He just let him go with it. Yeah, just get out. Yeah. So I don't know. There's a lot of factors here. So as you look at that, it's just interesting to consider and to look at.
maybe he let him go just because he didn't want to be embarrassed to his people.
Possibly.
He's a Pharaoh and he didn't want to be embarrassed that he was stupid.
Yeah.
Get out of my way, get out of town, I won't see you anymore.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Never come back. Don't tell anybody about this.
Yeah. Possible.
Maybe for it to be an unconditional promise, somebody has to do something wrong for you to unconditionally promise them and love them. Generally, you're not perfect with people.
Yeah.
Unconditionally love you, you're not. No matter what
Yeah.
you do.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
It is. It is.
Might be why he lied. Then God went on and forgave him. Unconditional promise, whether he lied or not.
Mm-hmm.
God was going to provide the unconditional promise. And maybe God told him this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
God might have told him, I'm not sure. It's just a thought.
Yeah. Well, and also it's good to speculate, because we don't have the answer 100% about who told what. I mean, we can speculate there. But what is interesting to note, though, is Abram left greatly blessed. So what does that tell me? That regardless of how that he failed, I mean, God was still going to take care of him. He was still going to prosper him. He's going to bless him, because he'd made that promise. And these promises are listed here in the first part of the call in chapter number 12 as we look at those verses 1 through 3. These promises were given to Abram about how God was going to prosper him, give him a good name, bless his name. He would have many descendants. I mean, a lot of interesting things here as we look at that. So, anybody else with a thought? Nobody? All right. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully you've enjoyed we going through each week and just kind of looking at different things. And it's just interesting to look at this and see how all things took shape and form and have moved forward, even from the beginning, looking at Adam and Eve, and then seeing Cain and Abel, then seeing Noah, his sons, their descendants, moving forward now as we transfer into this phase of seeing Abram, and then we'll later see his name changed to Abraham, and then we'll see Isaac, and then Jacob, Esau. All these things, we'll see it all come to fruition and see how God had a plan, and his plan fulfilled through the people. And Abram, who he chose. I mean, there was nothing really special about Abram per se, but God chose him as the one that would, through his lineage, would have the descendants, and that would be important for how all things come to play. All right. Well, thank you for being here tonight, and please remember Sunday about the love offering. We have these envelopes if you'd like to give one and be prepared for Sunday to give. We'll be taking that up, and then Tuesday I'll be able to deliver that to the family. I'm looking forward to seeing them, hopefully being able to pray with them. I can't imagine what they're going through right now, just so much uncertainty right now with what they're facing, and just a lot of challenging days ahead, and just praying that God will give them the comfort they need, and also just please pray for this family, because like I've said, they've been here before, and I appreciate them, and I'm glad that we can serve them in this capacity of helping them financially, because there are some costs that they're going to have to meet, and they're not cheap. So please just consider what you can give, and that'll be Sunday as we'll take that up. Also, the lady from Family Promise, hopefully, I think she's going to be able to come back Sunday. She was supposed to be able to come this past Sunday. We're going to give her the gift, and that'll be this Sunday, prayerfully, that we can give to her. So we're really thankful that we can do that. Helping individuals in the area that do not have a place to stay, needing lodging, and also just meals and things like that. We're just doing whatever we can to help them in that avenue. All right, let's go ahead and stand to our feet, and we'll pray, and we'll be dismissed. Joe, would you pray for us, please?
Father, we thank you so much